Tactics and Practice podcast.
Dobar dan, everyone, and welcome to the Tactics and Practice podcast, the audio extension of Aksioma Institute for Contemporary Art's discursive program of the same name, focusing on investigative art, society, and new technologies. This podcast series is part of the 15th edition of Tactics and Practice called Unreal Data, Real Effects. I am your host, Nea Berger, and I conducted a series of interesting conversations on this topic. In the previous episodes, I talked to Felix Stalder about individuality in relation to property, quantification, and the paranoid self, and discussed more ways in which data abstracts reality, their histories, and possible exits with Wendy Hui-Kyung Chun. This week, we'll be exploring methodologies for investigating training data with Eryk Salvaggio. Eryk is a writer, author of Cybernetic Forest blog/newspaper, among others, a researcher and new media artist interested in the social and cultural impacts of artificial intelligence. Hi, Eryk. Thanks for joining us.
Hello.
So the silver lining of our conversation with Eryk today will be on approaches, be it in artistic practice or in theory, to decoding at least some layers of today's notorious black boxes, talking about ML-based models mostly. And I thought we'd start with something very tangible today, a methodology that Eryk documented on his website/newsletter, Cybernetic Forest, where you can check out his great writing, by the way, and we'll include the link in the notes. So a methodology for researching, testing, deducing what we might find in the data sets of the fusion models, such as Dall-E or Midjourney, based on the outputs of prompts. Can you tell us a bit about these methods?
Yeah, it started by working as an artist and having an interest in early GANs. So this was before the current wave. You had to collect a lot of the data and put it together yourself, and the model would create images based on the input that you collected. Classic sort of data in, data out model. And you would sort of realize as you would go about collecting these images, in my case, I was literally taking photographs with a camera, that there was always a limit to what it could generate. This was very evident. This is not a shocking finding. If you worked with early versions of these tools, if you had 500 pictures of the beach, you got 1,000 more pictures of the beach. And when we started moving into the current wave, this diffusion-based system, this relationship became a lot less direct because the images in the training data are all kinds of things. There's cat pictures and medical records and who knows what else. And so it's much harder to see exactly what it is that created that image. What is the data in the data set that contributed to the concept of the image we look at in a diffusion model like Dall-E or Stable Diffusion? In order to try to think about this, I started thinking about these tools, or kind of thinking about these images as data visualizations, that they are making a map of the kind of photographic circles. I call them central tendencies of all the images associated with your prompt. And I looked at it kind of in a couple of ways, thinking about these sort of classic experiments that now anyone can do in a classroom, where you ask, what does a typical American look like? And so you look at the images that come out of it, and they're and I'm an American, so this is why I use this example. I could see, everyone has American face paint on. They have cowboy hats, right? They're kind of overweight. All these stereotypes of Americans. And when you look at that image and you break it down in a classic sort of media studies kind of way and say, what are the things in this image, right? This is like, this all goes back to Barthes in a way. What exactly is in the image? List it out, and then look at the training data, if you can, and see what in the training data actually informs those specific things. And one of the surprising examples that comes out is there's the American in the photograph is holding a cup, a giant cup. And if you look in the training data, there's sort of a meme of this American holding a giant, we call them big gulps. They're these sort of enormous 2-liter cups full of soda and ice. And so there's this meme that occurs over and over and over again in the training data associated with the word American. And it does come through in the image as well. So that's sort of the methodology in a nutshell. I break it down in the article you referenced called How to Read an AI Image. But that's the methodology as I have it.
So what have been some things that you found through this method of trying to decode training data sets or the original images? Or how can we detect biases that the model might reproduce?
In a couple of workshops, I've been able to travel and talk about AI with folks. And whenever I go somewhere new, I've been asking them, what should we prompt? Let's take a look. Lately, it's been with Midjourney in particular, because right now, all of the training data is offline for everything. Even these so-called open source models like Stable Diffusion, you can't actually look at the data set. So if we want to make the point about what are the biases in these things, we generate images. So recently, I was in Australia, and we asked, let's ask what a typical Australian looks like for Midjourney. And we generated, usually with this method, you generate at least 9 images. I mean, Midjourney generates 4 at a time. So we did, I think, 16 images. And then you take these images and you can actually see that there's pretty common patterns. Now, when I say this, a lot of people who work with sort of AI art in a generative art kind of sense, they're taken aback and they comment that like, oh, but the images, there's infinite variety. You can actually famously never get the same image twice. But you could get the same kind of structure over and over and over again. This is this phrase that I use, central tendencies. It's not about getting the exact same person, picture after picture after picture. It's about getting the same types of characteristics of a person over and over and over again. And so for American, as I just described, you get sort of the cowboy hats, you get the leather jackets, overweight, holding coffee cups and giant big gulps and so on. In Australia, you had a surprising thing, which is sort of very burly men with beards, a lot of flags, because these categories, the way these words are connecting to categories of images, if you ask for a country name, you're going to get the flag of that country because that's heavily there, right? Australian, American, the flags of those countries are in that training data. So for the Australians, long story short, burly men, beards, right? For the most part, white men, which is not the native Australian person, and occasionally sort of kangaroos and weird marsupials, which is the first time that I'd seen a non-human show up in this experiment.
That's pretty cute.
It was also like a strange hybrid koala kangaroo. So it wasn't even like an accurate version of either of those animals. So you could say like, why? And this is the question I ask whenever we generate an image is, how does Midjourney know what an Australian looks like, what an American looks like? Or more sort of nefariously, how does it know what a criminal looks like? So you go into these professions. You can ask Midjourney what a professor looks like, and you get these elderly white men in lab coats. And you don't see many women. In fact, we did this in the UK, and the results were all elderly white men with one woman, not a single person of color, right? Only sort of one woman represented. The rest were men, and white men and elderly white men. And so there has to be something in the training data that is sort of gearing the model towards that as the central tendency. This is how I'm using that term, the central tendency for that prompt. And you could see, if there's not women there, then women are not in the data set. If they're not coming out, then they're not heavily present in the data set. That means that the data set is heavily skewed toward elderly white guys, both in the UK and in definitions of professors. So you could start analyzing things that way. But it's become a little bit more complicated because some of these models will interject, they'll insert a diversifying prompt. I call this shadow prompting, so that you don't actually know when you ask for a picture of a professor that the model is actually giving you a response to a different prompt, because OpenAI or Gemini, or whichever tool you're using that does this, has inserted a random phrase like black or woman into your prompt in order to give you this diversification, which recently we saw this sort of classic example of, Gemini only generating
racially diverse Nazi soldiers. Is that the
right? Yeah. Exactly. Yeah. And yeah, like black Vikings. That is kind of overly calibrating. Gemini was sort of a swing to overly calibrating for diversity. And a lot of people were sort of like, oh, it's quote unquote woke. But actually, what you're seeing was this system level intervention, because the data is so biased in the other direction that you need to push pretty hard on the acceleration pedal to move away from the biases inherent in the training data. So that actually wasn't this sort of quote unquote woke thing, right? It was actually the training data is so biased and stereotypical that you have to accelerate almost extraordinarily hard in order to get away from its biases. So yeah, those are some of the things we found in these experiments. And there's a lot of other things you could do with this in terms of like what types of places, what types of homes are represented in this data. But figuring out how it makes sense of categories in general is a really interesting aspect of how these models work, because they're essentially a categorizing engine.
Mm-hmm. So it comes down to, let's say, in this first step of our decoding, to figuring out both the biases from the training data sets and the influences of the various filters that the owners of these models will implement, and kind of the interplay between the two, which is already like a whole thing to unpack by itself. But if we move to a second layer, I guess, I mean, this is already extremely important, right? Especially in pointing out possible biases that the models reproduce. But coming back to the context of the so-called original photos in the training sets, for example, and of course, we're simplifying here, but let's say we began with this layer of decoding process back to these training sets, and you showed us a very tangible methodology that anyone can try to apply. But now, let's say we arrive to this second layer where we're still talking about diffusion models that produce visual material, not, for example, natural language models. But let's talk about the photos themselves, right? And you mentioned Bart before, for example, but the photos, I mean, there's so much theory on this, but already existed in a very precarious kind of ontology. I would like to connect us here to an episode we did in the first series of Tactics and Practice called Scale with Anthony Downey, where we talked about Flusser a lot and the concept of the technical image and the programmatic element of photography as an apparatus. So how it doesn't capture reality, but enables us to see or not see certain realities that it produces. So Flusser thought the rise of the technical image was a big shift in how our relation to the world is mediated, as the printing press was. If the printing press created a linear history, the technical image is kind of seductive to try to decode it as showing the world out there, but it actually consists of the science behind the black box through which it is produced, right? So there's a whole machinic layer of interpretation, and its product, the technical image itself, is resistant in a way to decoding. Or Anthony, I think said resistant to critique. Do you have any thoughts on this layer?
Certainly. It's been a while since I've read Flusser, which I'm going to mangle in my American pronunciation. But
no, I think that was right, actually.
I've read him, found it extremely interesting. And all of this sort of reminds me, one of the common mistakes I see with AI in general, right? Just to go very big, one of the common mistakes I see is that there is a level of abstraction that happens that we then sort of take on as fact. And with these AI images, what we often see when people sort of come to understand the biases is they say, well, it's a reflection of the real world, right? But actually, if you look at the training data, it's not a reflection of the real world. It's a reflection of a highly curated world, which is the world of online photo websites and social media sharing and the words that are used to describe it. And so that is a kind of social interaction that people are having with the internet, which is sort of we might call it a technical device in and of itself, right? The internet is a mediating layer. And then the way that these things get broken down and reassembled can often confuse that original context. So what you're now seeing is not a representation of the world, but a representation of how images that we share online are mapped to texts that are used to sort of categorize them, which are all automated. It's an entirely automated process. There's a lot about ghost work and the invisible labor of AI systems, and that is true. There are workers who are engaged with looking at an image, making sure the label is correct. And that created this thing called clip. I don't know how technical we want to be, but clip basically says the pixels in this image look like the word in the caption, therefore it's a match and it is that thing. Clip was written by those people, right? People at home all across the world, most likely working for very cheap pennies, and to label these images to make sure that it could recognize sort of bloody content, gory content, sexual content, and then flag that and remove it from a data set. So there's that economic apparatus around these images too, exploitative economic apparatus. And then what happened was when they built this data set Layon 5B, this collection of 5 billion data points, which is 2.3 billion images and 2.3 billion text lines, they applied clip to filter that. So in other words, humans built a text image sort of connection model, and then they took that away from people, right? Humans were no longer involved. Only the sort of residue of what humans had done was involved. And then they took that residue that was trapped in clip, this language and image recognition model, and they applied it to the entire internet to determine if the images that they scraped, the 2.3 billion images, were actually what they sort of were in the text description. So what's happened there is you've got this sort of ghost element of all this labor that's been put into this model, right? These ghosts are now looking at this residue of images that we've posted online, and it's entirely inhuman. And as a result of that, a lot has gotten through that probably if we were to curate a data set the way we would an archive, or to think about it in the sense of what do we want at the heart of these data sets and these AI tools, we wouldn't have allowed these images in. These are images famously now, I think, well, who knows how famous, but disturbingly, certainly, the Layon 5B model, which was the heart of Stable Diffusion, had to be taken offline because it contained child sexual abuse imagery. So nobody went in there and could look at this and say, like, let's not do this. Now, there are ways of doing that, right? The social media platforms, even though they're terrible at it, there are ways of looking at these images, knowing and mapping the sort of hash, the digital pixel thumbprint, right? Pixels are color patterns arranged in rows, right? That's what a digital image is. And so you could recognize what those rows are, and you could use that to filter out suspected content of that type. Pornographic contents, even sort of consensual pornographic contents should be removed from these systems through that method, presuming that we don't want to create realistic deepfake pornography, which, again, another recent thing was this Taylor Swift thing that happened on Twitter, right? People could use these tools. But there's also images in there that of like torture at Abu Ghraib, There's weird terms associated with things like even the word archive. I went in there and I looked at the word archive and what images are associated with archives. And it leans really heavily into Holocaust imagery. But also in the archives are Nazi memorabilia. And that's another interesting, disturbing linkage, because these things are being fused together and then generating a kind of new image. So there's this history and this context that's getting almost sort of decimated. It's like going into a town and demolishing the town and then building a new town on top of it and just being like, we've done it. We've built the new beautiful town, and then forgetting about what the actual origins of that place were. There's this colonizing aspect to it, I think. So that takes us very far away from the technical image and this kind of thing. But it's where my mind goes, where I think about this mediation, right? Of the what we call the representations of the world, which are actually photographic documentation of the world that we have self-selected to share and labeled according to our own biases, that are now being sort of fed into this machine that is being filtered through another machine that has trained on this kind of exploitative human labor of analysis and image recognition. And then that becomes a data set. And then we go in and we prompt it and we say, show us an archive. And what comes out is this strange fusion of historical images that have no business being placed not just side by side, but literally fused into each other. And I think that is a important thing to think about when we're looking at these images and thinking about how to read them and how to interrogate them. And so a lot of my work, both as a researcher and an artist, is about thinking about what's coming out of these models and why, what's putting that there.
Yeah, I read your piece on the prompt about the archive that generated this image where it most likely fused these Holocaust imagery and German soldiers on vacations images together in a sort of, I think you called it techno-optimist aesthetic or something like that. I mean, we probably can't talk about like an aesthetic, but we can talk about a devoid of context, new kind of aesthetic.
Yeah.
That was very interesting. And I think we unpacked actually in your thoughts right now a whole new layer, right? The invisible labor layer of AI. This is a reference. I mean, all of these layers are probably a reference to Kate Crawford's work, Atlas of AI. She was also a guest on the second season of our podcast. I think you mentioned at some point in one of your texts how all of this invisible crowd work and invisible unpaid, underpaid labor that goes into training various models also ends up, as we have seen with numerous platforms, working towards the goal of getting rid of the worker altogether, right? Of this automation and replacing the worker.
Yeah. In that layer too, we talked about the sort of the ghost work and the click work. And obviously that's important. That's why I mentioned it. There's another sort of thing that's being lost in these models too, which is the invisible labor of the artists and the photographers and the people who are taking images and sharing them online for their own communicative purposes, right? To say, here's a picture of my dog, here's what I had for lunch, right? All the sort of banal social media things. I mean, my dog is very important, but you know what I mean? We're sharing these images, not really aware that they are being almost like a wiretap, right? There's this interception that happens where when we're on the phone, we assume the phone company doesn't have access to our telephone conversations, but when we're on social media, they actually do have access to our images and they can do whatever they want with them and they can use them as training data. At least in the US. I don't know how it is with the European privacy laws, but in the US, when we are sharing things on social media, essentially Facebook has the right to do what they want with them. And this changes that relationship to the image a lot. Going back to also, Flusser, about the images now, I've likened them to the equivalent of punch cards, except the holes are smaller. Punch cards you used to use to feed to the machines in order to give it the program.
That's
right?
interesting.
And now what we're doing is we are essentially programming an artificial intelligence system, an artificial generative intelligence system with our images without knowing it. But all of the pixels that we are collecting about the world in these images are now being a kind of essential layer of shaping the output of these systems. And that really, I think, captures something that matters a lot to me, which is about this. We talk a lot about copyrights and what comes out of the machines and how they circulate and whether they're putting artists out of work and all of this. And these are very important questions. Labor is a very important question. The erasure of the artists in the training data set is a very important question. There's also, beyond the sort of copyright legislation or legal question, there is also the question of our data rights. Like, what right do I have to that assemblage of pixels? Because I've written it in a way, I've used a device to write it, but I've written an image, I've captured an image into pixels. And so do I have the right to that? And we would say no, because we're thinking about it as a cluster of pixels, right? And that's how AI training data looks at it, is like as a cluster of pixels. But when we zoom out and we look at it as humans do, which is, this is actually a photograph that's important to me, right? Then it changes our relationship a little bit. Like, it's something different to call that training data or to call that something that can sort of be broken down and studied and then reproduced theoretically, not directly. And I always get angry people telling me it doesn't copy and paste. And exactly, it doesn't, but it informs a concept. And we're building that model. We're not being paid to build that model. We're not being asked if you can have a picture of my deceased grandmother in order to put it into a training data set of Nazis and child pornography, right? I don't want that for myself. I don't want that for my grandmother. Do I have a right to say no to that? So on a human level, photographs have this other relationship with photographs as well. So yeah, I'm not sure I answered your original question, which happens a lot with me.
No problem. I mean, I think we're basically covering everything just in a more circular train of thought pattern, which works for me as well. This would probably be a good point, considering the time as well, to move to another layer that I wanted us to talk about, which is the computer science math layer that presents itself as very pure numbers or pure math, also devoid of any cultural, social, historical context. But I'd like to start opening this up with something we already talked about in my conversation with Felix Stalder, which is thinking about what even is quantifiable, right? So a data point is understood as this number derived from an external event, but it's actually inherently ambiguous. It's not natural fact at all, but a representation created in a process of cultural fabrication that creates what it calls reality then. And on top of that, something that Felix pointed out as a second unknowable, there is the knowledge that quantification does not create. Numbers are derived from measurement of one aspect, but indicating other aspects that have not been measured. And even measuring several of them, a full picture will never emerge from an assembly of dots, right? Zooming in will mean more empty space between those dots. So operating already on extremely shaky grounds in our little decoding in terms of how inherently ambiguous the entry data that these systems process is at the very beginning. And then there are questions that we could open, I thought, about how social and political contexts shape how these technologies work, even on a very formal level. I don't know if you've had a chance to check out Matteo Paschinelli's very recent book, The Eye of the Master, where he traces AI as intelligence of labor and social relations. But you've also written about, and I have a quote here, of how gathering data itself is an exercise of power that starts by reducing the world and people to samples of behavior, and then imposes rules and assigns categories and limits or allows sets of actions. And you've written about AI as a rebranding of data analytics that, of course, emerged not as some kind of pure science of data, but out of an example that you mentioned is like slave boat insurance schemes, for example.
Yeah, I agree fully. The way we gather data is definitely taking this sample of the world and this entire idea of digitization. You can think about it with like digital music, right? We actually have with the CD, we used to talk about the sample rate, right? How many little samples of the sounds are captured each second or each cycle. And then you piece them together close enough. And the idea is that you get something that actually sounds like a sound wave, but you've made it out of off and on signals, 1 or 0, presence or absence. And I think, so a couple things. One of them is that every pixel in the generated image, just to get back to this idea of like decoding that generated image, reflects kind of a binary decision, a yes-no decision at some level. It's just that they are so compressed. There's 16 million sort of pixels in an image that have to be drawn for an AI image, an AI generated image. And so the word decision is also very laden with a sort of human idea. But each of those pixels is drawn by statistical representation of something in the training data. So if enough pixels are clustered around and it has to draw another pixel, it's going to look at those previous pixels and associate it with something that it has seen in the training data set. And it's going to reproduce that. It's going to write that image. I have likened this to big data and data analytics and the way that human behavior has been captured, particularly by social media. AI would not be possible without the vast stream of data that the internet has made possible. Essentially, these machines are the same as the decisions, quote unquote, decisions that get made about what we see on our social media feeds, right? Not technically the same if you look at their architecture, but in principle, the logic of them is the same. It is going to say, we want to know exactly what this person has clicked on before, because then we can say they're going to click on this and we're going to show them that so that we can get more money. Over time, there is, I think, some risk, some fear that that behavior, once captured and predicted, becomes constrained to those predictions. That, you know, this flattening of culture through algorithms. I think there's more hope than that because people do negotiate. Humans do negotiate with algorithms. They figure out different ways to approach it. They figure out how to hack them, how to misuse them, right? We've learned how to ignore advertising. We've learned how to use ad block. We also toy with the algorithms. We play with the algorithms. And so this idea, yes, we are gathering a sampling of the world, and there's an easy mode that we can use when we engage with these things, which is like, I will watch whatever Netflix recommends to me. I will buy the book that Amazon tells me to read. I will listen to what comes up on the Spotify podcast. I will take the image that the AI generating image system gives me. But there's also a different way, a different relationship that humans can have, which is the assertion of agency over that flattening. And I think one of the important things that I think people should start thinking about more often is how they want to refuse what comes to them through these systems. Because that's a missing piece, right? That's one of those pieces, that human agency, that human creativity is one of those pieces that exists sort of between the dots of the images and the pixels. It's one of those things that can be used to scratch at the surfaces that algorithms constantly are trying to reproduce. We want to get beyond surfaces, and we can do that. We aren't limited to the screen. We aren't limited to what these algorithms give us. These algorithms are very much limited. They have their central tendencies. Maybe someday that changes, right? The AI people who have newsletters and blue checks on Twitter are constantly telling us it's going to change, it's going to change, it's going to change. But I think if you're gathering data and you're trying to say, what's the average of all that data, you're always going to come up with a pretty flat result. And so if humans want to assert any kind of agency over it, this idea of creative misuse is really important to me, of going in and figuring out, how are we going to disturb that central tendency? How are we going to explore what's on the periphery of that central tendency? How are we going to get at what's underrepresented in the data set, in the algorithms? And that matters, I think, a lot.
Of course, that's crucial at this time. And speaking of hacking and misusing algorithms and human agency over flattening, this really reminds me of Shocker Flusser, right?
Uh-huh.
But seriously, though, the act of intervention into so-called program of an apparatus, right? If you remember this sort of analogy where he talks about it, this intervention would mean producing a kind of unpredicted reality within or through or with the apparatus, which is, of course, paradoxical in a way because the model itself already contains all of the possible outcomes it could produce, right? But nevertheless, what I consider to be very interesting and, of course, important, crucially, interventions into the business as usual side of how AI is used and applied today systemically would definitely be the kind of thing you're doing with this hacking. And for example, the kind of thing that you and your colleagues at the Algorithmic Resistant Research Group are doing. So this would be, for me, I think, an intervention, if one can ever exist at all. And when I say this about existing, it's just to bring another level of theoretical reflection, right? So thinking about intervention, therefore thinking about art, because that's what a true intervention would be for me. And I owe all of my reflection and realizations on this topic to a media theorist and artist, Polona Tratnik, who is my professor and also wrote a book called Art as Intervention, among others. Anyway, so the question is just, can anything in this system really be outside of it? Because it would have to be for an intervention to exist. One can't intervene from the inside. Are we a priori already within? I would like to think interventions are possible. And certainly playing against the original, let's say, design and intent of the program of the apparatus, like Flusser talked about, would be on that very edge, on the very border of creating something new, something not predicted. So this is also a great opportunity for me to ask you for the end to tell us a bit about ARG and your interventions there. That's how I'm calling them now.
Yeah, I think that's a good phrase. So ARG it's a pretty open group at the moment. It includes Steph May Swanson, Caroline Sinders, Sherry Wong, and myself, kind of as sort of the core organizers, but that's been shifting and changing, and it will always take different forms, hopefully. But the idea there of the Algorithmic Resistance Research Group is to think about this idea of algorithmic resistance and what forms it can take. For me, what that means is I'm interested in actually to sort of challenge this idea of something that you just said, which is that all sort of possible permutations are contained within the model itself. So that is true. If I'm looking, and nothing against, there are some artists who are working with these systems and, this post-photography stuff. I do find it really interesting. I find there's a lot of interesting conversations around it. I don't know exactly that I'm quite in that space because I'm not using the model to get at images. What I'm using the model to do is get at images it can't produce. And so one of the techniques that I've been using, and I think it's important framework for thinking about it, is to think about how the technology works itself. You could apply this to anything. You could apply this to any kind of algorithmic system. But with diffusion models in particular, they work through noise. They start with a randomly generated constellation of pixels, right? Just pure digital noise. And they try to add noise until certain clusters appear, and then they sort of hone in on those clusters and they sharpen and define those clusters toward the image that you've described in the prompt. And one of the things that was interesting to me was to think about what it would do if you asked it for an image of noise. it can't generate an image of noise because its entire modus operandi is to strip noise out of the image.
Mm-hmm.
So it's adding noise, subtracting noise, adding noise, subtracting noise. But every time it removes noise, it is removing noise toward the prompt, but the prompt is more noise. And so this sort of confusion in the system about what exactly it is supposed to produce is coupled with the fact that the noise that is in the sort of resolution of the noise, the pixel count in the image that it starts with, is much higher than the images that it can produce. And so there's this constant negotiation between the pixel count, the 16 million pixels that it's supposed to try to generate, and the clarity of individual pixels in the image. Now, it's pretty technical, but ultimately the end result is that you've rendered an image that has no reference to the data set because it can't do it. Even if there were images of Gaussian noise in the training data, that's not what comes out. And if you prompt it with this prompt of asking for this type of noise and pair it with images of anything else, it will often obliterate the other image. So I'm thinking about that. I'm thinking about it in these traditions of like Namjoon Paik, who, applied a magnet to the television to distort the images. I'm thinking about bands like Suicide, who took these church organ drum machines that did these sort of very simple waltzes and then like plugged them in with too much power and created this sort of stomping punk beat in the early 70s. And even like hip hop and taking these record players and using them and turning them into instruments. This is where I'm really interested in thinking about what I can do and what my relationship to these models can be that isn't going into that training data to reproduce something, because I don't want to. And I know that other people don't have the sort of guilt complex that I have, but I don't want to generate images from, child pornography and Nazi propaganda. And I understand that people don't see it that way, and I'm not accusing them of anything. But once I was in there and I saw it firsthand, it was like very hard for me to ever think about these images as anything else but a recombination of trauma. And how do we get beyond that? How do we get beyond these sort of trauma collages and into something that is arguably a new shape, a thing that the model can make that nothing else could make? That's what I'd be interested in. Something novel from these machines. And so there's these ways of exploring these models and their limits that gets at these peripheries, that gets at distance from what they're being sold to us as. And I think that is good not only for what it produces, but also for the gesture of it. I think that gesture is important to model. And I think that's at the heart of a lot of what ARG is doing.
Absolutely. And what I meant when I was asking you this about the model containing all possible permutations wasn't implying that your work, for example, is working with the model as it was meant to be used, right? Just generating images, for example. It was more pointing out the inherent theoretical paradox in this thinking about the apparatus as a kind of reverse Cartesian model of a universe of all possibilities inside and its manifestations outside, right? But hacking this is paradoxical in a sense, right? In just a very formal sense, as it still would contain the possibility, but it really didn't predict it. So that is the difference, I think. And this kind of practice that is an intervention and using it in a way that it actually decodes and that it shows a bit of its workings and the black box inside is definitely something I would personally call a definition of art, I guess. I hope that's cleared up. And it's...
Yes. I took it as an invitation to distinguish my work from it, not as a critique of what you're saying, because I'm aware we're in the same boat here.
Yeah, absolutely. And and like I said, I mean, this is the kind of intervention that shows towards the inner workings of something that is so hidden and really steps toward decoding. So decoding was also what we talked about for about 50 minutes already. So Now we have to stop. I would like to thank you again so much for coming on the podcast and all of your interesting insights.
Oh, thanks so much. And it's always great to talk to people who've read all this stuff. And it's great, really thoughtful set of questions and prompts. So thanks so much for your care and thought and time.
Thank you. Thank you so much. That's it for today. Thank you for listening. Unreal Data, Real Effects is a series of podcasts conceived and conducted by myself, Naya Berger, for the 15th edition of Tactics in Practice, the discursive program of the Aksioma Institute for Contemporary Art, curated this year by Mediengruppe Bitnik in collaboration with Janez Vakiniansha. For more information on the context, participants, and partners involved, see the links in the description. This episode was recorded and edited by me. The music and audio post-production were taken care of by Gaspar Torkar and project coordination by Marcela Okretic. You're welcome to visit aksioma.org, where you'll find a wealth of free content. And if you like what we do, consider supporting us on Patreon or by making a donation. Next week, I'll be joined by writer and researcher Günseli Yalçın-Kaya to discuss online culture and how we've transitioned from the golden age of shitposting to the mind-flattening sameness of the mid. But that's it for today. Greetings from Ljubljana and na svidanje.
Tactics and Practice Podcast.